So Tom Brake is the director of Unlock Democracy, the campaign group that organises and campaigns for democratic reform and for a new democratic system. We're going to be talking today about the series of proposals that Gordon Brown put forward to recommend to the Labour Party on its policies on democratic reform. But before we get into all of that, I just wanted to say a big welcome to Tom. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure.
So I mentioned there Gordon Brown's report on democratic reform. So that came out at the tail end of last year with a series of recommendations for the Labour Party to adopt on their policies when it comes to democracy. What do you make of that report?
Well, I'm pleased with a lot of what it says, although I know a subject we're going to come on to later is proportional representation, and on that subject it is silent. In fact, it wasn't even within the remit of Brown to consider that. But I think in terms of what's in it, we produced some research just over a year ago called Local Government in England, 40 Years in Decline. And we commissioned some academics to look at how powers for local authorities had been changed and, in fact, how they've been diminished over the last 40 years. And that is under a succession of governments of different political persuasions. And some of the problems that that research identified, and indeed some of the solutions, are solutions that are now reflected in the Brown Commission report. So, for instance, the idea that local government, for instance, the powers of local government should be locked in. In other words, there should be a constitutional guarantee that local authorities can't have their powers taken away from them by central government. So, as I said, there's a lot of good stuff in the Brown report, but there are some absences, and PR is one of the most obvious ones.
So you said there, yes, that proportional representation for elections to the House of Commons isn't something that was recommended by Gordon Brown. Why do you think proportional representation is so important as part of this conversation about democratic reform?
I think because if you look at countries, particularly in Europe, that have proportional systems, then first of all, proportional systems ensure that people's views, people's political views are reflected accurately in those who get elected. I think that should be the fundamental principle associated with any electoral system, that how people vote is reflected in who gets elected for different parties in any parliament. And clearly, with our first past the post system, that does not happen. And that's why we've had a series of governments, whether it's the most recent government or the government that Boris Johnson was elected Prime Minister of, or indeed the Blair government, a series of Blair governments were elected with a minority of the national vote, but got, in some cases, under Blair in particular, a very, very comfortable majority in Parliament, which meant that the minority view was able to impose a view on the majority. And often a majority might have been opposed to decisions that, for instance, the Boris Johnson government was taking, but because they ended up with an 80-seat majority under first past the post, they were able to push through things that, in fact, the majority of people didn't support. The other thing to say about other European countries that use PR systems is that I think what it does is it provides for government that is more about continuity, because one of the big problems we've seen is the pendulum that exists in British politics, where under first past the post, one lot will get elected on a minority of the vote. They will then push through an agenda that 4 years later, typically, the other lot might get elected on a minority of the vote. They undo the agenda of the previous government before imposing their own agenda. So we have these big swings in political terms, and they don't tend to have that in Europe, where they use PR systems. And those countries are principally, mainly richer than us. They have better health than us. They often have a more a more detailed, more appropriate approach to environmental issues than we do. So there are lots of benefits to PR, And that's why I think it was regrettable that, for whatever reason, the Brown Commission was not tasked with looking at that.
So I'm going to go to a question from the chat now on this topic in particular. And for our viewers, please do get questions for Tom in the chat. The earlier you get them in, the more likely I'm going to be able to put them to him. So now's your call for questions. So Steve C has asked, does the report from Gordon Brown lack legitimacy as it doesn't speak about PR as we've just discussed? And do you think that it really, that lack of recommendation around proportional representation tarnishes the wider report's recommendations?
Well, I think as I said, there are proposals in the report which Unlock Democracy would be are completely supportive of. So the idea that local authorities, for instance, should be given a 3-year horizon, fiscal horizon, so that they know over the next 3 years exactly how much money they're going to have to spend, for instance, would be a novel and very sensible approach that we would entirely endorse. So I think the fact that PR isn't there, I think, doesn't actually detract from the other sensible proposals that are in there. So, I mean, looking at those, so the idea, for instance, the heading "Renewing the Purpose of the United Kingdom," which looks at locking in a constitutional statute, for instance, that would guarantee how powers between the different nations in the UK, how they operate and where they overlap and so on, I think would be a sensible approach. A lot of the proposals around the regions and England in particular about giving more powers to towns and cities for them to determine their future are ones that, again, Unlock Democracy would be very supportive of. One of the major problems we have in the United Kingdom and in England in particular is the fact that we are still a very, very heavily centralised nation, where Westminster still dictates an awful lot of what happens around the 4 nations of the United Kingdom, but even at a lower level than that. So anything we can do to push powers down so that the English towns and cities and indeed regions have a greater ability to, for instance, raise money themselves to spend, but also are given powers such as a proposal that came out of the Brown Commission report, which I think is a very sensible one, is the idea, for instance, that local authorities should have the powers to take on job centres. As it happens, as a result, principally of COVID, this government did give a certain amount of funding to local authorities, district councils, for instance, which did not have a job centre in their area, gave them money to set up, in effect, job centres or hubs, employment hubs, as some of them have been called. I think that is something, the sort of power that should be taken up at a local level, because it will be the local district council, the local borough council that will often have the relationships with businesses locally. They will know what vacancies there are. They will know what skills are missing. So all of those things are good things that are in the report, but some of the omissions, for instance, there are omissions around the powers that are going to go to Scotland or the powers that are going to go to Wales. A lot of people thought that the report would have a lot to say on that, because one of the reasons for the report, or at least that's what we thought, was to try to diffuse the arguments of those who want independence for Scotland. But actually, there's very little in there. So, I mean, again, I've given a very long answer to say that I think there are still very valid proposals in there. The omission of PR was really regrettable. Of course, what we have had from Labour Party members at their conference just 3 months ago was they voted in favour of proportional representation. And therefore, at least from the party members and indeed the unions, because the unions also voted for it, there is a commitment to that. It's just that the leadership of the Labour Party don't seem to be as committed as the members and the unions are.
So I'm going to take that last question from a slightly different angle now. And, we've had the report has had a number of criticisms, as we've discussed so far, and some of that stuff that you just discussed about Scotland and Wales and devolution and so on. We had a guest earlier on the show, Laura Webster, who's the editor of The National, pro-independence paper in Scotland, who was very critical of that aspect of it in particular. And we've obviously discussed the shortcomings when it comes to proportional representation and other elements. But even with all those caveats, this would still, with things like House of Lords reform, a whole bunch of the other proposals in there, represent probably the biggest constitutional change for the better that we've seen, at least for a generation, if not much, much longer. Do you think that's the case?
Yes, but I do think it's the case, and I suppose the first question mark is whether any of it will actually happen, because I think the impression that I get from that Keir Starmer and the leadership's position is that there are core areas that they will want to focus on, and the economy clearly is one of those. Health is another. Tackling antisocial behaviour, for instance, and it's not clear if that is they're going to be their priority, how much of what is in the Brown Commission report is actually likely to get taken up by the Labour Party. I mean, or a Labour government, if that's what happens after the next general election. One thing that does give me some hope, of course, is that what the Brown Commission has done, and what Keir Starmer, by endorsing it, has done, is highlighted that there are certain problems with our economy that are linked to the fact that we are so centralised as a nation. So that those towns and cities in England that I was talking about before, and indeed in the other nations, don't have the powers that they need. But these problems about centralisation are also often the problems associated with our democracy, that people's views are not reflected in those local decisions. They're denied local democracy because too many of those decisions are still focused in Westminster, with ministers trying to take decisions for them. One area which I think we would all need to be careful of is that, for instance, there are some aspects of what the Commission report says about, for instance, every single town or council should have a plan for growth, a plan for prosperity. Historically, talking to people who worked in local authorities, for instance, historically under the Blair government, there was a period where local authorities were having to report on something like 200 different targets that the government thought that they should be measured with. We've got to make sure that the balance between giving those local powers, I think the balance should be giving people local authorities, local people, the flexibility to choose what they want, rather than necessarily having to report to central government, which has said each and every single area has to have a growth and prosperity plan. And I rather suspect that if that's what they are saying, that central government may be drawing up for them exactly what they think should be in that growth and prosperity plan, thereby taking away from local democracy and trying to impose from the centre what they think such a plan should look like. And I think we've got to be very wary of that.
So before I let you go and enjoy the rest of your Sunday, I just have one final question for you. And I guess when we talk about political democratic reform, I find it's quite often easy for us to get stuck in technicalities. So, often we'll end up talking about the relative merits of a preferential voting system or a multi-member constituency voting system, or we'll talk about the specific makeups of the upper chamber in Parliament. And often that can be quite turgid and difficult for people to engage with. So I wondered if you would be able to kind of imagine you're speaking to an audience of people who aren't yet convinced about the need for democratic reform in the UK, and give your kind of overview and vision of kind of what Unlocked Democracy's vision for a new democracy in the UK would be.
Sure, that's a really good question. And you've correctly identified that one of the problems I think that organisations have is being able to put across these ideas in ways that are relevant to people. But I guess my sort of elevator pitch, so to speak, my 60-second explanation of what we're doing is, people want to know that when they express views, that they have the chance to, first of all, elect people who are going to represent those views and elect them accurately according to how they have voted. That's what a proportional system does. People also want to be able to participate. They want to be party to decisions, not just by voting in an election once every 4 or 5 years, but there are other ways in which people can participate. And that's why, as an organization, we promote the idea of citizens' assemblies. So that's a group of people who are chosen to be genuinely representative. It's not a self-selecting group of people who decide they want to express a view on a subject. It's 200 people typically, chosen scientifically with a methodology to make sure that they represent the whole range of views. They represent the whole gender range, the whole demographic range, and so on, and that they are then given the task of working out often some quite difficult issues, or finding solutions to difficult issues. In the Republic of Ireland, it was looking at the question of abortion and looking at equal marriage. And so people are given a chance to take part in some really critical decisions collectively, and then feed in their recommendations to a political process. So it's about making sure people's voices are heard through the people through the people they elect, but also giving them an opportunity, if they want to participate throughout the year, in effect, in making decisions that are going to affect their lives. And that's why it matters to people.
Tom, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for joining us.